It was a chilly autumn evening, and Paul found himself alone at home. His parents had gone out for the night, but they had left clear instructions. Andrew, Paul's older brother, was supposed to stay behind and look after him. Paul initially thought Andrew was home, but an unsettling silence filled the house. The feeling of being utterly alone began to creep in. Unable to shake his unease, Paul decided to check on Andrew. He knocked on his brother's bedroom door but received no answer. Pushing the door open, he found the room empty. Andrew wasn't there. The bed was untouched, and a faint glow from an unused phone charger blinked in the corner. Confusion gave way to dread as Paul realized his brother had left him alone. Grabbing his phone, Paul immediately called Andrew. When Andrew finally answered, he tried to brush off Paul's concerns, claiming he was still home, likely hoping to avoid trouble. But Paul, already having searched the house, knew better. Frustrated and scared, Paul pressed him until Andrew admitted the truth. He had gone to a birthday party, leaving Paul by himself. Paul's fear quickly turned into anger. He reminded Andrew of their parents' instructions and demanded he come home immediately. Andrew, trying to calm Paul down, promised he wouldn't be gone long and encouraged Paul to go to sleep. But sleep was the last thing on Paul's mind. Feeling abandoned and vulnerable, he warned Andrew that if he didn't return soon, he would tell their mom. Knowing their mother would be furious, Andrew panicked. He tried to bribe Paul into silence, offering him money in exchange for keeping quiet. Tempted by the offer, Paul reluctantly agreed to wait, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach remained. As the night wore on, Paul struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind, seemed magnified in the stillness. He lay awake in bed, glancing at the clock as the hours ticked by. Then, just after 3 a.m., he heard it, a noise from downstairs. Relief washed over him. Andrew must finally be home. Eagerly, Paul got out of bed, ready to confront his brother for leaving him alone for so long. But just as he reached the top of the stairs, his phone buzzed. Andrew had texted, saying he was still on his way home. Paul froze. Confusion turned to dread as he processed the message. If Andrew wasn't home yet, who, or what, was downstairs? He slowly descended the stairs, his breath hitching when he noticed the back door standing wide open. The cold night air seeped into the house, carrying with it an ominous stillness. Realizing someone had broken in, Paul's heart pounded in his chest. He raced back upstairs, his fear pushing him to lock himself in his bedroom. His hands shook as he locked the door and backed away, every nerve in his body screaming for safety. Sitting in the corner of the room, Paul hugged his knees to his chest, trying to steady his rapid breathing. His ears strained to catch any sounds from outside the door. And then he heard it, the slow, deliberate turn of the doorknob. Someone was trying to get in. The rattling grew more aggressive, the doorframe groaning under the pressure. Paul's entire body trembled as he listened, every second feeling like an eternity. His mind raced with the possibilities of who, or what, was on the other side. He couldn't scream, he couldn't even move. Just when the noise became unbearable, a sudden commotion erupted outside the room. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by muffled sounds of a struggle. Furniture toppled over, and heavy footsteps stomped back and forth. Then came the sound of someone screaming in pain, their voice raw and desperate. Paul remained frozen in his corner, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't know what was happening, but the chaos outside his room made his heart race even faster. Moments later, the noises subsided, replaced by silence. Then, a voice called out to him from the hallway. It was Andrew's voice, calm but urgent, telling him everything was okay and that it was safe to come out. Paul hesitated. The fear still gripped him tightly, making him question whether it was truly his brother or something else. Slowly, he approached the door, unlocking it cautiously. Peeking out, he saw Andrew standing there, slightly disheveled but unharmed. Relief flooded through Paul as he opened the door wider and rushed to his brother, throwing his arms around him. Andrew held him tightly, apologizing for leaving him alone and promising never to do it again. As the adrenaline began to fade, Paul finally felt safe. He realized just how lucky he was to have his brother back, even if it meant scolding him for his poor choices later. For now, he was just grateful the nightmare was over. It was nearing 3 a.m., and the room was dimly lit by the glow of Jack's television screen. He and his best friend, Philip, had spent the last 6 hours gaming, determined to beat an infamously difficult level. The game was known for its unforgiving mechanics, with enemies that seemed to read your every move and traps that tested your patience. After countless retries, frustration, and near victories that slipped through their fingers, they finally succeeded. The sense of accomplishment was electric, and Jack let out an excited cheer, startling the quiet stillness of his empty house. Philip's laughter crackled through Jack's headset. The two boys bantered back and forth, teasing each other about their numerous failures and joking about their unrelenting determination. Jack, still buzzing with adrenaline, suggested they keep playing. He wasn't tired in the slightest. His parents were out of town, so he had the whole house to himself, no curfews, no interruptions, just hours of uninterrupted freedom. The idea of his parents being gone for the weekend had thrilled him. Jack wasn't the type to throw wild parties, but there was something liberating about having the house to himself. He could stay up as late as he wanted, leave dishes in the sink without anyone nagging him, and, most importantly, play video games until his eyes burned. It was the kind of freedom he rarely got, and he intended to enjoy every second of it. Philip hesitated, glancing at the clock on his end. It was late, far later than they usually stayed up. Still, Jack's enthusiasm was infectious, and he agreed, albeit reluctantly, to one more level. "All right," Philip said, stifling a yawn. "But after this, I'm out. I've got practice in the morning, and Coach will kill me if I'm half asleep." "Deal," Jack replied with a grin, already navigating through the game's menus to set up the next level. They were discussing their strategies and favorite characters for the next round when Jack suddenly froze. He'd heard something, a faint noise coming from the direction of the front door. It was unmistakable, a soft but deliberate knock. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly dismissed it as his imagination. Who would be knocking at this hour? But then it happened again. The same knock, rhythmic and measured. Jack stood, his pulse quickening, and turned his gaze toward the dark hallway that led to the front door. He hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or ignore it. The knock persisted. Curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, Jack made his way to the door, his footsteps barely audible on the carpet. He hesitated for a moment before leaning in to peer through the peephole. What he saw sent an icy chill down his spine. A man stood on the porch, shrouded in a black hoodie. His posture was slouched, his face partially obscured by the hood. But what Jack could see of his face was horrifying. Blood streaked down his forehead, pooling around his eyes and dripping onto the ground below. The man's lips moved as if he were speaking. He claimed he had been in an accident, his car crashed in a ditch down the street. He said he just wanted to borrow Jack's phone because his phone was dead, and no one else had answered their door. Philip, already set to play on the other end, asked Jack why he hadn't set up yet. Jack told him about the man outside his place. Upon hearing about it, Philip urged Jack to stay away from the door. "This is weird," Philip said. "Don't get involved. It's not safe." Jack wrestled with the decision. What if the man was telling the truth? What if he genuinely needed help? His mind raced with possibilities. He thought about the stories his parents used to tell him about helping others in need and being kind. Could he really ignore someone who might be in danger? Philip's voice crackled through the headset again, louder this time. "Jack, don't do it. Seriously, man. Something's off about this. Against Philip's increasingly frantic warnings, Jack made his choice. He approached the door again, his hand trembling as he reached for the lock. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, but he silenced the voice of doubt. He turned the handle. The door creaked open. The man on the porch looked up, his hood falling back slightly to reveal more of his bloodied face. His eyes were wild, darting around nervously as if he were expecting someone, or something, to follow him. "Thank you," the man rasped, his voice hoarse. "I just need to make a quick call." Jack nodded, stepping aside to let the man in. He handed over his phone, his fingers brushing against the man's cold, clammy skin. Philip, still on the other end, kept telling Jack not to open the door, but then there was no reply from Jack. Philip waited for Jack to return. Minutes passed, then an hour, and Jack never came back. Concern began to gnaw at Philip, and he called out to his friend through the headset, but there was no reply. Philip's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jack was never one to leave without saying something. When morning came, Jack's parents arrived home to find the front door wide open. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Jack was missing. The police conducted their investigation, and it was revealed that no accident had occurred that night. Philip felt crushed and blamed himself for what happened. He kept thinking that if he had tried harder to convince Jack not to open the door, maybe what happened to his best friend wouldn't have happened at all. The fear of not knowing whether Jack was okay or not haunted him, leaving Philip with a heavy feeling in his heart. Rose woke up to an overwhelming, nauseating smell permeating her house. It was sharp, acrid, and unmistakably foul, like rotting garbage but far more intense. She sat up in bed, wrinkling her nose and trying to figure out the source. Her mind raced through possibilities, maybe the trash, or food gone bad in the fridge. Shaking off the unease creeping up her spine, she climbed out of bed, determined to locate and eliminate the odor. She started in the kitchen, methodically checking the trash can first, then the refrigerator, and even the sink's garbage disposal. Nothing. The smell wasn't coming from there. She moved on to the bathroom, wondering if there might be some plumbing issue, but again, everything appeared normal. Frustration mounting, Rose ventured into her bedroom, looking under the bed and behind the furniture. Still nothing. The smell seemed to cling to the air, lingering no matter where she went. It was then that she remembered the basement, a dark, damp space she rarely visited. She hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding settling over her. The basement had always creeped her out. It was old, with crumbling cement walls and dim, flickering light bulbs that barely lit the narrow staircase leading down. But she had no choice, the smell was strongest near the basement door. She glanced around her hallway, noticing the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, distorting as if they had a life of their own. She shook the thought away, blaming her overactive imagination and lack of sleep. As she opened the basement door, the stench hit her like a wall. Gagging, she covered her nose with her sleeve and descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the old wood sending chills down her spine. The air grew colder as she went deeper, and the faint light from the single bulb overhead cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The smell intensified with each step, and by the time she reached the bottom, her stomach was churning. She scanned the room, her eyes watering from the stench. Her basement was cluttered with old boxes, discarded furniture, and other forgotten belongings. She followed the smell, her heart pounding louder with every step. It was coming from behind a stack of boxes in the far corner. With trembling hands, she began moving them aside, one by one. And then, she saw it. A body. A man's lifeless body lay sprawled on the cold cement floor. His clothes were rumpled, his skin pale and sickly, and the unmistakable stench of decay clung to him like a shroud. Rose stumbled back, her heart racing as a scream clawed its way out of her throat. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. Who was this man? How did he end up in her basement? She hadn't been down here in weeks, and she lived alone. The questions came faster than she could process them, and before she knew it, she was dialing 911, her fingers trembling as she tried to explain the situation to the operator. They said they'd send someone, she whispered to herself after hanging up, pacing back and forth. But fear gnawed at her. What if the police thought she was involved? It was her house, after all. The body was in her basement. Trying to calm herself, she forced herself to take another look at the body. It was lying face down, the head turned slightly to the side. Something about the man's appearance nagged at her, a strange sense of familiarity. With a deep breath, she reached out to turn him over. The moment she saw his face, her blood turned to ice. It was him. The man she had gone on a date with the night before. She recognized his black jacket, the distinctive tattoo on his neck. It was unmistakable. Her mind reeled. How could this be possible? She had just seen him alive, vibrant, and laughing over drinks at the bar. They hadn't even come back to her place. She'd gone straight home after saying goodnight. A horrifying thought struck her. Had he followed her home? And if he had, how had he ended up dead in her basement? Before she could dwell on it further, something else caught her attention. A slight movement. Her breath hitched, and she froze. Had she imagined it? No, there it was again. His hand twitched. She stared, unable to look away, as his fingers moved ever so slightly, as though trying to grasp at something. "He's moving," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away and ran to the basement stairs and hid under it. The man's body jerked slightly, then began to move more deliberately. He pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and awkward, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. His head lolled to one side, his cold, dead eyes staring blankly ahead. Rose couldn't move. She was paralyzed with terror, watching as the man, who had been unmistakably dead just moments ago, staggered to his feet. He turned his head slowly, his lifeless eyes scanning the room. And then he started sniffing the air. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through Rose. It was animalistic, predatory, as though he were trying to scent her out. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream and moved in closer under the staircase, pressing herself into the shadows. The man's movements were slow and jerky as he began to shuffle around the basement, his head swiveling back and forth as he sniffed the air again. Rose's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. He moved closer, his steps dragging on the cement floor. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed as she watched him approach the staircase. She could see his feet standing before the staircase. Rose was so scared, she thought he was about to find her. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen, rooted to the spot, but then he paused, tilting his head as though listening for something, and then he began to climb the staircase. For a moment, she thought she was safe. How is a dead person moving, she asked herself, and then she remembered something that happened when she was on the date with him. She remembered seeing a strange mark on his face. It looked like his veins were coming out. It was like his skin was almost gray and the veins were darker, but then it went back to normal. She thought she was just seeing things. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps on the floor above reached her ears. He was still searching for her. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She was about to dial 911 again, wanting to ask where they are and how long will it take it for the police to arrive, but then she heard it, footsteps moving down the staircase where she was hiding. This time it was faster and more purposeful. It was the man. He had found her. He reached his hand under the staircase and dragged Rose out. Rose tried everything she could do to get away from him, but his grip was too tight. Rose kept screaming and trying to get away from him, but then he used something to hit her on the head and then she blacked out. Minutes later, the police arrived at Rose's house. they found the front door unlocked and the basement door wide open. They noticed muddy footprints scattered across the floor, large ones that didn't seem to belong to Rose. The officers searched the house room by room, calling out Rose's name, but there was no response. Rose was nowhere to be found, nor was the man she had mentioned to Amber. The only thing they discovered was Rose's phone lying under the stairs, the screen shattered and damaged as if it had been deliberately broken.